Sirs, Mons, ladies and gents, welcome back to the Redcoat History YouTube channel, the place for people who love British military history and a damn good story. We've got a cracking interview today with Jack Bowsher, author of Thunder and Meiktila 1945, the greatest combined arms manoeuvre battle of World War II. That's a big claim, isn't it? But can Jack live up to it? Or can he defend that point of view? We'll find out today. Today, Jack's talking with my good friend Chris Brice. Now, this is a pre-recorded interview, so I'm not going to be involved. I'm going to be playing you this, but I am here to join in the live chat and to take your comments and put them up on screen so that other people will be able to see them. It's a really fascinating interview. In it, Chris asks Jack all sorts of questions. The importance of the Indian and African troops, what Slim's secret weapons were, how he was able to achieve such effective results with such limited forces. It's all there, as is a pretty strong argument from Jack as to why Slim might just be the greatest British general of all time. You don't want to miss that. All right, let's get stuck in.
Lots of people think of the Burma campaign as like and not without good reason, but that it kind of culminates with the Imphal and Kohima battles. And probably the two most famous battles of the campaign and so on. And the reconquest of Burma, unless you're an aficionado of the Burma campaign, you look at that campaign as something that's amazing. But for most people, it's just mopping up. Imphal and Kohima have happened and Burma is reconquered the next year. And sort of, I think what we need to remember is there are a number of really important things that take place is that the Japanese are definitely beaten quite decisively in Imphal and Kohima. Let's not get that wrong. But remember, that's one of three different armies of the Japanese, as in the army, as in administrative units, who are fighting in Burma. And obviously, 15th Army are the ones that have attacked Imphal and Kohima. But there are still two other armies in Burma. And the entire country needs to be retaken. They're not going to leave the Japanese be. They're not going to, the British and Indian army, they're not going to just let the Japanese have Burma. No one knows that the atomic bombs are in production, for example. That's by far the most obvious thing to just bear in mind, really. We all know that atomic bombs are going to be dropped on Japan. But very few people, it's always worth remembering, Truman, the vice president of the United States, he doesn't know about the atomic bombs. And so we always have to remember that when we think about the 1945 campaign. The two key things about the Burma campaign is they have to keep up the pressure on Japan from every single available option if you're the Allies. And also, probably the bigger reason is you have to keep China in the war, tying down, 1.5 million Japanese soldiers. And so, therefore, the Burma campaign is all about making sure those things happen. And it doesn't finish with Imphal and Kohima. What Slim has to do is he wants to cross into Burma and defeat the Japanese army and reconquer it. And so I think what's worth remembering here is we go back to 1942 when the Japanese first invade Burma. They charged through that country in a matter of about 6 months, give or take. Okay, technically it's about 6 months. Probably really the fighting is about 4.5, 5 months. But they first step over the border quite quickly after Pearl Harbor. The main point that I'm making here is that much of that campaign is about jungle fighting. There is a brief period in the middle of that campaign where it takes place on the central dry belt of Burma, but then it goes back into jungle again. In 1943, it's mostly jungle fighting in the coastal Arakan region. 1944, it's the jungle and scrubland mountains of the border between Burma and India. And so we have this conception, and also the Chindits, the importance of the Chindits. These all make us think of Burma as being this country of jungle. And the thing is, the jungle gives the Japanese an awful lot of inherent advantages. The Japanese army since the 1930s, and it's important to say they haven't really moved on from this, is a light infantry army. And so the Allies' big advantage by end of 1943, beginning of 1944, which Slim is very, very conscious of, is that whilst the Japanese are a light infantry army, the Allied army, so Britain and the Indian army in particular, they have become combined arms forces. So very famously, air power has become very important to 14th Army, but also armour and artillery as well. And a lot of my previous research has been in the armour side of things. and I came on, last year with Redcoat History to do that. If listeners want to go back, viewers, want to go back and look at that. I've done a video with Chris before on tank warfare in Burma on the whole, and so therefore what you have is this decision by Slim to utilize the advantages he has as a combined arms force to then strike the Japanese. But it's really important to him to destroy the Japanese army in the central dry belt of Burma, which I'm sure we'll talk about more later. He wants to destroy the Japanese army so that he can then advance to Rangoon without actually having to fight a major battle inside the jungle. Like I said, we'll get into the detail of that. But
yeah,
if he fights in jungle, he cedes advantages to the Japanese, a light infantry advantage. Very short range, very small scale fights in the jungle. Whereas what Slim really wants is a big, decisive Clausewitzian, Nelsonian sort of decisive battle in the middle of Burma, rather than the jungles of southern Burma.
I mean, as you say, there's a lot there that we'll get into in a few moments. I've no doubt. Just stepping back a little bit, and I think to an extent from what you've said, we sort of get an idea of this. But what made you want to write this book?
I'd say myriad reasons. By far the biggest thing was, I wrote the first book that I wrote, Forgotten Armor, was based on an overall idea of research about. I'd read lots of reports and or books and things like that just kind of, tanks were always tangential to the battle, and it's infantry and jungle and all that stuff. And I always felt like that it was overlooked. And so there is a little chapter. I do one small chapter on this particular battle. And when I was writing the dissertation for my master's that became the first book, Putin invaded Ukraine, and we happened to be studying the 2003 invasion of Iraq by the United States, famously the Thunder Run to Baghdad. Because I make no pretense that I've invented the phrase Thunder Run. There'll be lots and lots of viewers here who will know all about the Thunder Run to Baghdad and other operations that are similar. I am putting that moniker retrospectively onto this particular battle for what, as we get into this, I hope will be really obvious reasons. But the mixture of Putin invading Ukraine, and he tries what I would roughly regard as being an attempted Thunder Run on Kyiv from Belarus. So remember, he drives south. There are those really, really famous, footage of Russian logistical vehicles, lorries, nose to tail on a highway moving south and stuck there. And then the Ukrainians being able to use UAVs and drones and missiles to take out a lot of that logistics that blunted the spear of the Putin Thunder Run to Kyiv. At the same time that I was studying the very successful version that the Americans did to Baghdad. And it was kind of that thing where you're thinking, what did this side do right and that side do wrong, and all the different factors that come into that. And I was doing the reading for the dissertation that became Forgotten Armor. And I realized that this attack at Meiktila, this battle at Meiktila, was a Thunder Run. It was the same principles that both the Americans were doing in 2003, Putin was doing in 2022, and that Slim did in 1945. And so I couldn't miss that chance. For me, it was that. I'm very proud of the title Thunder Run. I think it's a cool title. It drags people in. And it's just that thing of, I thought it was interesting. All those things came together, and I was like, yeah, I can't miss this opportunity. So that was the second book. That had to be the second book. So what was a chapter in the first book became an entire book. And in Forgotten Armor, it's a single chapter just about the tank units, Probin's Horse, Deccan Horse. Thunder Run is about the entire 3D battlefield, infantry, armor, artillery, air power, so on.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to a very good point I wanted to raise with you there, actually, because you called the subtitle of the book is The Greatest Combined Arms Manoeuvre Battle of the Second World War. That's quite a statement.
It's a bold claim.
Yes. Can you explain to us, why you think that, and what do you think makes this victory superior to perhaps some of the better known battles?
Yeah, okay. So one of the things I put on the back of the book, and I do stand by this, is if Meiktila in 1945 had been done by Guderian, Rommel, if it had been done by Monty, Patton in particular, and Zhukov, everyone would know about it. it would be the kind of battle that we all know as part of the pantheon of fascinating manoeuvre battles of the Second World War. My basic argument for Thunder Run is that I've mentioned the 3D battlefield. This is it's air, it's land power, it's air power, and it's a deep thrust behind enemy lines. It attacks a nodal point. It then holds that nodal point 80 miles behind the Japanese front line. It survives entirely on air power. It relies on air artillery, ground attack aircraft, effectively, as well as conventional artillery, self-propelled artillery, and so on. And it's the way that also that the defense of this nodal point is not a static defense. So, and this isn't a fair comparison, but the defense of Bastogne is in the Battle of the Bulge. That is a static defense. Meiktila is also surrounded by the Japanese, but it is not a static defense. And what it does is that Slim basically creates, roughly speaking, brigade groups, sometimes slightly smaller, but brigade group strike forces, as many as 6 of them per day. And what they do is they leave the harbour at Meiktila each day, and they strike at the Japanese in 6 different directions, sometimes for 2 or 3 days. But the important thing here is that the brigade groups that he sets up, they go as much as 20 miles away for 2 or 3 days at a time. And the big thing they do at Meiktila is they are finding the Japanese wherever they can, and maybe we'll get into exactly how they find them later. But when the Japanese are forming up to attack Meiktila, they send out these groups, they destroy the Japanese, and then they withdraw back inside. So it's almost like a reverse whack-a-mole, if you see what I mean. The Japanese are trying to get in, and then Cowan, David Punch Cowan, who's the guy that's actually in charge within the town, he sends his brigade groups out, strike the Japanese before they really get organised, before they get concentrated, and then basically spend 6 weeks, 5 to 6 weeks, trying to just attrit the Japanese to the extent that they break, leaving the door open to Rangoon. And so the important point here is the combined arms manoeuvre battle here is because they are using those brigade groups. And it should be said, this is what NATO was to a degree planning if the Russians invaded during the Cold War. It's about small combined arms brigade groups striking individual Russian units. Slim is doing that in 1945 at Meiktila. And so that's really what the point of the tagline, which I grant the tagline is partly to engender some conversation, but I will stand it up. I do think that it's an overlooked combined arms battle that I'd at least make the case for. People don't believe me, fine, fair enough. But read the book and they can make their own decisions.
Well, that's the thing about history, isn't it? As long as you can support it with evidence and a coherent argument, there are no wrong answers. Well, that's what we like to tell us. And that's what we like to tell ourselves anyway.
Yeah. People think I'm wrong, then fair enough. But I'm happy to talk about it. And if people don't agree with me, fine. But if they enjoy the book, great.
I think there's certainly a case to make to it, and I think you raised an interesting point at the start of your answer there, which was regard to Slim, and perhaps he's we can get onto this a bit later about how perhaps he's underrated and where he should stand in the pantheon of great British commanders. But can you just talk to us a little bit about Slim, his background, and how he ended up at this point in 1945?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm very lucky as well because his grandson has recently become a bit of a friend of mine, and he's given me some great insights. So the thing about Slim to remember is it's very important to understand his background. Is he is not the traditional background of a British Army officer you'd expect. And that's not to say he's not a privileged person, but he doesn't go to private school. He goes to grammar school. He gets in because of his aptitude rather than, say, for example, he goes to Eton or whatever, like Wellington, for example. And so he has a groundedness, if that's even a word, but he has a much more personable approach. And because he joins the Indian Army, he has to become a bit of a linguist as well. He starts in the 6th Regiment of Gurkha Rifles, which, as it happens, a number of his divisional commanders, a couple of his chiefs of staff over the course of the war, all happen to be people. There's one of these things where everyone knows each other, and what it means is that in the Indian Army you have to be quite independent. You have to be good at languages, being personable is very helpful. And so when he learns the languages, Slim is able to talk to, Gurkha soldiers, and also Indian soldiers. I'm being very broad in the definition of Indian here. I'm talking about the World War II definition of Indian being modern day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. But he's able to communicate in Urdu and Gurkhali, and Urdu being the language that all Indian soldiers, even if they weren't born as Urdu speakers, they all need to learn it for the British Army. It's the chosen language of the army. And so he can converse with pretty much anyone. He can go up to, a private in the Gurkha Rifles or someone in the Gawali Rifles or whatever, and he can have a conversation with them. And he makes an effort to do that in a way that, say, Mountbatten, who is also very personable, but he can't do that because he's not a Gurkhali speaker, he's not an Urdu speaker, and so on. He has a few stock phrases. Slim is able to really, really get people on his side. He is a very modern way to think about it, is a coalition builder. He's very good at speaking to various different people. For example, Stilwell, basically, he's the only British person that Stilwell really likes. Stilwell famously very acerbic, very Anglophobic, but Slim, Slim's his guy. And I think that's a really important part of Slim's background. But then you get to the fact that Slim is very much he is not someone who's rigidly stuck to his ways. He is someone who, if there is a better version of tactics or whatever, he will adapt. And that's very important because when he takes over Burkor in 1942, he takes over an army that really needs to be modernized. It's still stuck in the mid-30s, really. I'm slightly simplifying there. But ultimately, that's the rough point. It's not enough trained for modern warfare. What training it's had is too mechanized. It's not flexible enough. So he takes this semi-mechanized, but sort of late 30s, mid-30s mechanized idea, again, slightly simplifying, but and he then has to mold that into a jungle warfare outfit in late 1943 into 1944. And then he remolds it into a combined arms, very, very modern force, something that we would recognize very easily in modern armed forces. And I think that's the other part of his background, that flexibility, personability, flexibility, and also just his experience teaches him that boldness is key. And that boldness is going to be very, very important to the Thunder and Meiktila and so on.
Well, we've spoke about the commander there. Obviously, we've got a significant bit of his background there. Let's talk about his army, because it's, shall we say, it's a mixed force in many respects. There's British, there's Indian, but there's a lot more than that. Can you just tell us a little bit about the troops he had at his disposal?
Yeah, of course. So it's really interesting to understand this as well, that the Indian Army is a separate entity to the British Army. Administratively, they obviously share lots of stuff, kit, uniform, and so on. The Indian soldiers are still, though, administratively distinct. Monty famously tries to get into the Indian Army and can't because he doesn't have the good enough, what are effectively grades, to simplify again slightly. But what he has at his disposal is this Indian army that's about 85% Indian. And again, I'm talking the World War II definition of Indian army. So Pakistan, Sri Lanka, blah, blah, blah. But the other thing as well is that he's about 100,000. So that's about 2 million Indian soldiers. He's also got 100,000 African troops, 100,000 British. Not all of those 2 million Indian soldiers, by the way, are in Burma. I'm just saying that in India and Burma theatre as a whole. So Slim has under his command an army that is almost entirely Indian. The British Army is down to as little as 100,000 in comparison. He's also got 277,000 American servicemen, mostly in logistical and aerial support. But that's always forgotten from this story that, there's almost 3 times as many Americans as there are Brits in this theatre. Which is why, for example, that a lot of Americans are very interested in the Burma campaign, which, for those that don't know much about the Burma campaign, very, very surprised, but it is very much an American story. The Northern Combat Area Command, their role with Chinese troops, and certainly air power, Stilwell as well in the early days. America is a huge part of this story, and also, of course, Lend-Lease, the role that Lend-Lease plays, and so on. And I'm sure we'll get on to maybe some of the kit the British are using at Meiktila as well. So this is kind of the polyglot force that he has at his disposal. And you've mentioned the African soldiers, and they're a particularly interesting group because, often the Burma campaign is called the Forgotten Army or the Forgotten War, Forgotten Army, Forgotten War, both. the African soldiers have forgotten.
Yes.
Because, like I said, there's just as many Africans as there are British soldiers in the theatre. And there are West Africans, 2 divisions of West Africans fighting in the Arakan, so they're not directly part of the story. They're very important, don't get me wrong, because if you don't capture Arakan in 1940, late 44 into 1945, you don't have the long distance air travel. If you're trying to supply British soldiers and Indian soldiers, in the bottom half, the southern half of Burma, you cannot fly from eastern India. You can't fly from Imphal. The Dakotas won't fly that far economically. You get to a certain point where basically you have to cut the tonnage. The weight of supplies that you carry in the Dakota. You have to start cutting that for every 10 miles that you're traveling beyond a certain point, and so it becomes uneconomical to use air power. The trouble is that if that's Slim's big advantage, he wants to use it, so they have to capture Arakan to resupply the battle that's to come. So the West Africans play a really big role, along with a couple of commando brigades as well. But they are separate to the story at Meiktila. And if people want to hear about it, Lucy Bettridge Dyson, a friend of mine, she's done a wonderful book called Jungle Commandos that I'd recommend if they want to hear about what goes on in Arakan, and in particular the West African troops. I begin Thunder Run with East African troops, so Kenyans, Tanganyikans, Ugandans, fighting out of Imphal at the end of 1944. Because it's really important to say is that at the end of 1944, we mentioned earlier that the Slim has won the Battle of Imphal, but that doesn't mean suddenly Burma is open. And the really crucial thing that Slim does here is he chooses to fight through the monsoon at the end of 1944 rather than rest, which for most of the rest of the war, that's generally what's happened in the monsoon. You take the monsoon as an opportunity, as an operational pause. You rest, refit, retrain, bring in reinforcements, and then you go back to the campaign. A bit like the campaigning seasons that you see in the Western Hemisphere and so on. Slim doesn't do that. And he happens to have this, the 11th East African Division. He also, unfortunately, 5th Indian Division, he also gets them to carry on fighting, even though they fought through February 1944 in Arakan and the admin box famously. They then fight in Imphal and Kohima. And then they're told, oh, yeah, by the way, you're going to fight through the end of 1944. They basically spend almost a calendar year fighting non-stop. So that's the 5th Indian Division. Famously, their badge is a red circle on a black background. So it's often called a rising sun, the opposite of the Japanese. But a lot of the soldiers call it the flaming arsehole. So you see that in letters and so on, the flaming arsehole. And I'm not surprised when you've spent 11 months of the year having to fight. But the other unit that's fighting in the monsoon is the 11th East Africans, and I follow those at the beginning of the book. Because if Slim doesn't do this, if he gives the Imperial Japanese Army, Burma Area Army, under their new commander, a guy called Hataro Kimura, if they give him the opportunity to rest and refit, they will not be there for the taking. And what Slim wants to do is to keep punching the Japanese as many times as he can. He does have a quote on this. I can't remember off the top of my head the exact phrase, but he basically says, you've got to keep hitting the guy over and over again repeatedly. And if he gives them the opportunity to rest, he will lose the advantages he has. He's got the advantages in numbers, so he can rotate a couple of divisions, famously the 17th Indian Division. So they're the one that we're going to come back to because they will go to Meiktila. But he can rest a couple of divisions, but he can keep other divisions in the line. Sucks if you're the flaming arseholes, okay? But apart from them, he's got other reserves that he can bring into action and allow others to rest, ready for the following battle that will take place in sort of February, March, April, May of 1945. And that's really the situation that we get into. So he's got Indian troops, East African troops, West Africans fighting in a different part of the geographical part of the theatre. And it's all about then he's using all of these forces really to push through against the Japanese, ready to really defeat them in, like I said earlier, a big Clausewitzian decisive battle in 1945.
You've already mentioned that this is quite a mechanized, motorized campaign, which I think would be a surprise to a lot of people because, as you've already discussed, We think of it as jungle warfare, the light infantry role, but I know you've spoken with Chris Parkinson recently, and in the past about the vehicles that were used. So we've talked about the Stuart tanks, the Lees, the Grants. Has anything really changed by the time we get to Meiktila in 1945?
Yeah, there's probably two big changes that have happened. So going back, and again, I did a thing with Chris a while ago where I did about tank warfare in Burma in general.
Hmm.
But the big thing that's changed by Meiktila is, firstly, the Sherman tank has started to arrive. Now, they were theoretically available at Imphal, but because Slim knew what he was going to do in 1945, he chose not to commit them. So there are units in India that could have gone to the front, but he doesn't want to. He feels like the units that are there and the equipment they have available is already ready to go. So the Lees, the Grants, Stuart's in the reconnaissance role by this point. But these Shermans are ready to be unleashed in 1945. Now, the thing is, they are actually have quite a lot of similarities to the Lee's Grants. And if anyone has seen a Lee Grant, that will be quite surprising to know. But it is worth bearing in mind is that whilst the Sherman has a smaller crew, it's the same 75 millimeter gun and the same 30 caliber machine guns as well, and so on. So they're not, in terms of firepower, they're not actually that different. They're a little bit lighter. That the reliability is the same and things like that. But they just give a little bit extra speed as well. They're a mobile tank. The other big thing that's a new addition in terms of this sort of thing is the M7 Priest self-propelled gun as well. So the 105 millimeter howitzer. Now it's interesting because, again, those that know British armour, they will know that in Europe they're using Sexton 25 pounders. They're all being sent to Europe. So the British get the American kit, even though it means that whilst there are field guns with the field artillery at Meiktila who will use 25 pounders, they are choosing to have the complicated logistics because they can have the self-propelled artillery. They think that complicating the supply of ammunition is worth the faff so long as they have self-propelled artillery, because they will join the brigade groups, the battalion and squadron groups of those mobile motorized columns that I mentioned earlier. They can join them, and that will become really, really important later. So yeah, the Sherman tank, the Priest self-propelled howitzer, they're the two really big changes from the Stuarts, the Lees and Grants that they had in 1943-44 in particular.
And I think you've answered this in to an extent in what you're saying there about the availability of stuff, but you describe in the book the Burma campaign as being the Allies' very lowest priority theatre. I mean, how did the sheer physical effort of building roads, moving massive supplies over hundreds of miles, compare to what was happening in Europe? I mean, surely this is a much harder task.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really important case study perhaps here to think about is the crossing of the River Chindwin and also actually the crossing of the Irrawaddy. So those are the two main rivers. There's a third river, the Salween, but that's more towards the Thai border side, so they're not really part of the story. The Chindwin River is the border, roughly. It's not the literal border, but it's roughly the border between India and Burma. The Chindwin, they make at the time the longest Bailey Bridge in the world, but the Canadians will actually supersede it on the Rhine about 6 weeks later. The difference between when the Canadians build their 1,800-yard long Bailey Bridge and the 1,300-yard one at the Chindwin is that 14th Army is having to bring these across a single track road from, first thing to say is the distance from Calcutta, which is the equivalent, really, the literal equivalent to, say, Antwerp. Now, Antwerp to the Rhine is about 100 miles, and it's over the Netherlands and the North German plain, flat terrain.
Yeah.
If you're going from Calcutta, you have to go all the way up the Brahmaputra Valley, and that's a bit of a dogleg, basically, across the top of a mountain range, or to avoid part of a mountain range. But you still then have to cross the bottom end of the Himalayas as well. And again, there's some complicated geography here that we don't need to get into. But basically, this Bailey Bridge has been delivered from the United States It then has travelled from Calcutta up the Brahmaputra Valley, hundreds and hundreds of miles. It then comes back south up a 4,000-foot high mountain range to Kohima. It then drops down to the Imphal Plain another 3,000 feet. It then climbs back over another 4,000-foot mountain range up into the Chin Hills, and then it drops down to the Chindwin, again another 3,000 feet or so. And we're talking by this point, that Bailey Bridge has travelled about 700 miles. So logistically, it is a completely different magnitude to what the Canadians achieve at Reese on the Rhine, compared to this one, which is only 300, 400 yards shorter, and all those mountain ranges. It's important to understand that the Western European road network is obviously much easier for the Allies in the Western European theatre to traverse. Whereas you get to Burma and also India, all of these roads are being built from scratch, and they're single track roads weaving through the mountains. And that has to be borne in mind as well. And it's, they're using, local Indian and also Chinese labor to build these things, and in the border areas of Burma, the Burmese labor as well. And they're doing this in a few different places. There's the Burma Road being built to China as well, separate from this. That's important to say. That is separate from this. So all these roads are being built from scratch, and they're having to then build these huge Bailey bridges. And then they're crossing down to the Irrawaddy, another 300 miles further south from the Chindwin. And this, again, I liken to the Rhine crossing, because the Irrawaddy is the thing that is 3 times wider than the Rhine. It's relatively fast flowing, and also shifting sands, which is not an issue in the Rhine crossing. The Irrawaddy has to be remapped by the Irrawaddy Flotilla Company in peacetime every single year so that they don't run their ships aground. That's not happened for 3 years by 1945. Since 1942, there has been no sounding. The Japanese are not sounding out the river to check where the sandbars are. So the Allies have to cross this with no previous knowledge, and they don't have the culmination of riverine or amphibious warfare. So at the Rhine crossing in March, you have things like the Buffalo Amtrak, the Amtrak, the amphibious things.
Yes,
you can see them in the Pacific and things like that. The Allies have nothing of that. Slim is having to set up, and when I did the research for this, there's a brilliant. I found a Royal Engineers document that showed they mapped out the production line on the Chindwin, where they were building out of the teak forests all of the invasion barges to cross the Irrawaddy. And then they were shipping them down the Chindwin to where they needed them, and the last little skip from the Chindwin because the Chindwin feeds into the Irrawaddy, but not in the right place. So they take them down the Irrawaddy, then a little bit overland to the crossing point of the Irrawaddy. And they then do this surprise crossing of the Irrawaddy. And it's literally, like I say, we're talking about, teak barges they've made themselves. They're using sections of Bailey Bridge with, outboard motors attached to them. And they're using little canvas collapsible boats. And again, if any of your viewers have seen A Bridge Too Far, when Robert Redford heroically crosses the Vaal with the 82nd Airborne, where we're talking that, but it's 3 times wider, another opposed river crossing. Whereas the Rhine is, the culmination of amphibious warfare. Like I said, it's a huge airborne operation. Plunder Varsity takes place. It is Plunder Varsity, isn't it? Operation Varsity is the airborne operation. You've got all of the artillery, air power, and so on of the Western Allies available to them. The Irrawaddy crossing is basically held together by paper clips and bits of string, and ingenuity. And they make this combat crossing. They have to force it through with firepower. They initially try to cross silently, and it goes wrong. And I detail this in the book. I've got a brilliant Royal Engineer who's one of the people taking the infantry across. First in secret and then under fire. And it's really, really amazing. They end up having to push it through with firepower in the end. But it's just this thing where the Western theatre has everything they need. Slim has to scrape it all together. And yet he achieves these ridiculously outrageous operations, really, when we think about it. They are outrageous. I am the wrong person to maybe judge Slim on the basis that he is a hero of mine. But, these are the things that make him what he is, I think.
So let's move on into and get into a bit more detail then. So what was Slim's plan, and what were the challenges that he faced going into the operations? I know you've spoken about some of them there, but I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, of course. So we mentioned earlier that the Japanese had to be driven out of India immediately during the monsoon to make it easier in 1945. The reason for that is because the Japanese, no one ever thinks about this, no one ever remembers this, but the Japanese take on 30,000 replacements in this period. And okay, they're not of the same caliber. That's really important. They aren't the same caliber as those that had invaded India at Imphal and Kohima. That is true. But 30,000 men is still a lot of men. Now, they lose about 53,000 combined at Imphal and Kohima, 30,000 on top. The invasion of Burma is not against a broken enemy. Battered, sure, but they're not broken. And so Slim has to think about that. The other thing as well that I also sort of hinted at earlier is when they attack Burma, what they don't want the Japanese to do is to retreat into really good geographical locations for the defence, and in particular, geographical locations that aid a defence that is a light infantry based defence. And so, I mentioned this earlier, the central dry belt of Burma, this big, almost desert like area that straddles the Irrawaddy River, and the Irrawaddy crosses Burma roughly diagonal, right in the centre. Slim wants to fight his battle there because that's where his advantages lie. If the Japanese retreat into the jungles of southern Burma, they will negate air power because your thunderbolt swooping in with rockets and bombs cannot see its target if it's dropping bombs through the canopy of the jungle. Whereas if you fight on the desert plain in the middle of Burma, you can see your targets. If you want to use big sweeping movements of Sherman tanks, you want the central dry belt. You can't do that in the jungles of southern Burma. So Slim is desperate to keep the Japanese in the middle of Burma on that central dry belt. And he has a bit of a warning sign. When they cross the Chindwin, as I said, with the Bailey Bridge and so on, in December 1944, the Japanese commander Kimura, he withdraws the army behind the Irrawaddy. And this is a complete shock to Slim and to the Allies in general. The Japanese have spent most of the war fighting for every single inch, tooth and nail. Japanese soldiers refusing to surrender, being killed in their bunkers because they will not accept defeat. And then all of a sudden, at the beginning of 1945, Kimura's retreating. And this is not what the Allies are used to. And so Slim is not spooked. He's not that kind of guy. But he's got to readapt now. The Japanese have pulled back behind the Irrawaddy. He has to do the Irrawaddy crossing that we mentioned earlier. But the other thing he wants to do is when he does the crossing of the Irrawaddy, he cannot afford to let the Japanese retreat into those jungles in the south. And so his plan is to make it look like he's going for Mandalay, okay, which is it's not a direct part of Thunder Run, but obviously it's an important part of the story. He has to make it look like he's going for Mandalay, but actually strike Meiktila to the south. And Meiktila is important for a number of different reasons. Firstly, it's at the bottom of the central dry belt. So if he captures Meiktila, he will trap most of Kimura's army, not all of it, but most of it, in the central dry belt. The other thing is that it is also a supply hub. The troops at Mandalay are not just cut off from the south, they're cut off from their supply lines. Now, obviously, there's more than one way to deliver supplies, but the main point is if the Meiktila is captured, the Japanese will have to counterattack. They can't just leave it. That will draw troops away from the Mandalay battle, making the battle at Mandalay easier, and it will keep the Japanese in the central dry belt and offer them up to destruction. And again, this sounds very crude. We could link this to, say, body count in Vietnam. I prefer to link it to, say, Nelson and his desire to annihilate the French. Nelson doesn't want, stalemate battles in the Napoleonic Wars. He wants to destroy the enemy. Slim is that. He wants to destroy the Japanese. And if he can bring them out into the open, bring them into the central dry belt, but not let them retreat into the jungles in the south, he will get his big Clausewitzian decisive battle. He will use his tanks, his air power, self-propelled artillery to then destroy the Japanese in these mobile columns that we mentioned earlier, to destroy them.
We'll talk a bit more about how successful it was in a few moments, but I did want to raise a point. There's the 17th Indian Division. There's a couple of men within it who earned the Victoria Crosses during the brutal fighting. Um, I mean, can you tell us briefly about their stories? I mean, we've got Fazl Din and William Weston, but can you tell us a little bit about what their stories tell us about how ferocious this battle was, and how desperate it was at times as well?
Yeah, because we've already mentioned a couple of times about the fact that Burma is more than just jungle fighting and things like that. The beginning of this battle at Meiktila, because it lasts sort of 5.5 weeks. The initial phase is the Thunder Run that charges from the Irrawaddy behind Japanese lines to capture the town, and then when the Japanese counterattack, destroy them. Fazal Din and William Weston are in that initial the battle really for the town. Once the Thunder Run has charged across and they attack Meiktila, they surround it and then attack it from multiple fronts. And what we don't think about is the fact that this is a street to street battle. This is soldiers going room to room, and floor to floor of buildings, into basements, up onto the top floors, and basically prizing the Japanese out of these buildings individually. And so Fazal Din and William Weston, their Victoria Crosses are quite different. And it should be said, by the way, that they're one day after the other, same division. We think about lots of Victoria Crosses are won by, Chris will love this, is that, Rorke's Drift is an against all odds victory. This is an against odds victory as well, because, Meiktila, they are surrounded and so on. But also their, great last stands, Arnhem, Kohima, which is also victorious, but they're great last stands, all these sorts of things. The Battle of Meiktila is neither of those things. This is a battle where it's a grim street fight, and there's no feeling where you kind of need to find heroes to justify some things. Rorke's Drift is the day after Isandlwana. Victorians are desperate for some heroes. Arnhem, desperate for some heroes. Whereas at Meiktila, what you have is you have a very, very functional, very, very professional, but very, very bitter street fight. And so Fazal Din, for example, they're clearing bunkers. The Japanese decide, instead of dying inside their bunker when a grenade is dropped through the firing slit or something, they charge out of their bunker, and they charge Fazal Din's section. He's just a Naik corporal. And the Japanese officer that comes to him stabs him through the chest, and the point, according to reports, the point comes out the back, that it was visible, protruding from his back. So he's been stabbed all the way through his body. Fazal Din manages to push the Japanese officer off of him, remove the sword, and then use it to kill the Japanese officer that attacked him, and then attack another Japanese soldier that is attacking a friend of his from his section. And so he takes out 2 Japanese soldiers on his own after being stabbed through his entire body front to back. And he then reports back to the platoon. And this is really important detail for the Victoria Cross as well. This takes place only about 30, 40 meters away from the platoon commander, who is directing his sections in clearing the series of bunkers in front of him. Fazal Din is in one particular bit. There are sections either side of him clearing other bunkers. And so all of this is witnessed not just by his own section, but by his platoon commander as well, and his immediate command troops around him. He reports to his platoon commander what's going on, who has seen everything. He collapses, taken to the first aid, the regimental aid post, and dies later that afternoon or early the next morning. And it just shows that desperation, but also the fact that these soldiers are fighting a really, really bitter hand-to-hand fight in a town rather than, say, in jungle or in the open plain, because that part of the battle really is after this bit. William Weston is very different, well, not completely different, but fairly different. The fighting has been so bitter that William Weston's troops have passed over a series of bunkers. They've had a bit of a turkey shoot at some Japanese trying to swim across a lake, which is a feature of Meiktila, is that it has 2 lakes in it, in the town. They've had a bit of a turkey shoot, and then as they're doing this, basically a bunker they thought was cleared opens fire. William Weston jumps onto a tank. He directs the tank to start, sort of hitting the bunker with some covering fire. He then charges it himself, and is hit as he approaches it. And as as he's been hit, he rolls forwards towards the bunker. And I'm a teacher and I teach some military history to students. A lot of soldiers, if they're running forward, they don't fall backwards like in a Hollywood film. Because they're running forwards, they collapse forwards. And that's important to soldiers getting infections and things like that from the bullet wounds and blah blah blah. The basic point is that Weston falls forwards, and then he rolls himself towards the bunker. He removes a grenade from his webbing, rolls into the bunker and destroys it from within. He basically commits suicide to destroy the bunker. And maybe he would have died of his wounds, but this is a 21-year-old second lieutenant. He's been there for a few weeks. He's only just met his men really just before this battle starts. He rolls himself into the bunker, kills himself, so no one else has to do it. He could have tried to roll away to safety and then get picked up by stretcher bearers and maybe would have died, maybe he wouldn't. But he decides, and I'm slightly speculating here, I suppose, but one of the weird things is I realised I used to work with his great-great-nephew, a guy called Mark, who's a wonderful guy that works at Watford Hospital. And I worked with him randomly when I was doing my undergraduate degree. I worked with him. Very, very nice guy. And had no idea he was related to this guy that 15 years later I'm writing about in a book. And he talked to me about, I contacted him recently and I just said to him, what's your insight? And he said he doesn't even know those guys. He's barely met them. And yet he made that sacrifice. He chose not to try and get rescued, whether he would have survived, speculation. He chooses to roll in there and take that bunker out with his own life. This is a young 21-year-old. It just tells you of the devotion to duty a lot of these men have, as well as the fact that it tells you what the Japanese are like, because he knows those Japanese are not going to surrender now they're surrounded. Yeah. He knows he has to take them out. In that split second, or a few seconds, he makes that decision. Amazing, amazing guy.
Yeah, I mean, amazing bravery in both the stories we've heard there. Fully deserving of the Victoria Cross. I do want to move on to another person who's involved in the campaign who will be familiar to us for other reasons, and that's George MacDonald Fraser, probably better known for the Flashman books, also as a screenwriter. I always remember the Three Musketeers version that he did the screenplay for. And I know he's one of the sources you use in the book. I mean, can you explain his part in the fighting and how it may have shaped his later career?
Yeah, so he's important because he's one of those people that, and very few people have got to the heart of this, I think. He really gives you an idea of what it's like to belong to an infantry section. There are lots and lots of memoirs. They tend to be by officers, although there are others. He gets the relationship between the different soldiers, the banter, for example. He's a sort of a recently remoderned phrase. He gets that banter right, or at least he gives you the impression of what it was probably like. Now, I think it's important to say, and I caveat this in the book. I mention it. He does admit that he cannot remember word for word what the conversations that he relates are. He says that they are broadly to the spirit of what was said and roughly along the lines. However, plenty of what he says is also corroborative. So for those that have read it, and if you haven't, thoroughly recommend Quarter Safe out here. He talks about people like a guy called Long John Petty, basically the only person he didn't change the name of, who's his platoon commander. He's 6'6". He was wounded at Imphal, and they all take the mickey out of him because when he's evacuated on a mule, his feet drag on the floor because he's too tall for the mule that's dragging him out to the regimental aid post. But anyway, he's back in the action by 1945 with George MacDonald Fraser. Now, Fraser is a conscript. He's been put into the 9th Borders, who are part of 17th Indian Division, but through a quirk of just decision making in the battle, he does not take part in the battle to take the town. David Punch Cowan, the commander of 17th Indian Division, he does have to husband his resources here. He's 80 miles behind the Japanese lines. He can't throw everything into the battle when he arrives at Meiktila. He has to judiciously select the appropriate amount of force, perhaps, to crack the nut, rather than just hitting it with a sledgehammer, which is what a lot of people would say that the entire 14th Army is using a judicious power rather than a sledgehammer to crack a nut. because remember, Cowan takes casualties, he will struggle to replace them. He's not in the line; he's 80 miles behind enemy lines, and it's even not even like Imphal, where he's Imphal, Slim's divisions there. They have an entire plain that's 25 miles wide and 45 miles long. He's got multiple air bases to do resupply. Meiktila is a single town with a single airfield, and he doesn't have enough men to even have a single set perimeter, which is why he does the mobile columns and so on. So Cowan in charge on the ground, he has not committed the Ninth Borders to battle at the time that people like Fazl al-Din and William Weston are doing the street fight. They are on the edge of the town, and they're basically just twiddling their thumbs whilst their colleagues in other brigades are fighting tooth and nail for every inch of Meiktila. What George MacDonald Fraser, though, is brilliant for is those armoured sweeps. Now, he's not the only source, I should say. There are lots of different people. I follow airmen. I follow a brilliant artilleryman who's a forward observation officer in who's directing the fire of self-propelled guns. Loads of different eyewitnesses. But when I look at Fraser, he does one of those sweeps that I talked about. He goes about 20 miles south of Meiktila. They spend 3 days at a place called Yin Dor, where they're doing miniature patrols. But the ultimate point is they're attacking the Japanese 49th Division, who are coming up from Rangoon, counter-attacking Meiktila from the south. And they basically lay waste to one of the regiments. So a Japanese regiment is a brigade in the British. So there's 3 regiments to a Japanese division. And they basically, roughly 30-40% casualties on this division. On this regiment within the division of the 49th Division. And he is a brilliant person for talking about not just the going into the battle, but also then being attacked in the middle of the night. And again, one of the most memorable bits is he talks about Long John Petty charging up and down, telling everyone what to do. But I should say, and I talk about this in the book, another one of my eyewitnesses is a guy called Peter Hazelhurst. And this definitely is where we get to Fraser's later career. Fraser is a novelist and a screenwriter. We have to remember that. His literary flair is definitely at play in Quarter Safe Out Here. So you kind of need to bear that in mind, because there are a number of his colleagues that were interviewed by the IWM who all have the same complaint. In Quarter Safe Out Here, Fraser puts himself in action that maybe other people were in the centre of and he was peripheral to. Not uncommon in a memoir, not uncommon. But it is important to note that this seminal memoir is really an impressionist piece, perhaps. So I do use him. I do use some of the stuff he says. I don't quote any of Fraser's dialogue because he admits that that's not right. But the impression that he gives you of what happened, when you then add in a couple of the eyewitnesses from Ninth Borders, particularly a guy called Peter Hazelhurst, and also the war diaries. And one of the things you find, the Indian Army is very professional. Their war diaries are so much better than conscript units of the British Army in Western Europe, where in a lot of the Western theatre army, and this is not a criticism, this is just the case that the Indian Army have had it drilled in them when they haven't got a lot to do. They must record what happened that day in the diary. So that's a piece of busy work for your adjutant. If you're up on the northwest frontier, so it's habitual to them. They write really long reports, which you do get, but you don't consistently get in the Western theatres. In the Indian Army, oh my God, every single war diary is a goldmine. And so it's very easy to check what has Fraser got right and what has he embellished his own role in. He's not horrific, don't get me wrong. Like he's not lying outright. He's just slightly closer to the action that he describes than he actually was. He was there, though. Don't get me wrong. And what he describes, generally speaking, fits. And what I've said is what fits, basically. What matches the 2 or 3 other sources. He's a wonderful writer. I cannot recommend Quarter Safe Out Here enough. I don't mean to be too bitter on him. I'm not.
So we've learned quite a lot about the campaign here. So can you tell us really how successful was the campaign, and also how important was the campaign?
Yeah, of course. So the main thing is it is a roaring success, to be honest. It is not the close run thing of, say, Kohima, which I suppose is another reason why you come to why it's less remembered, I suppose, because it doesn't have the drama that's involved. But that does slightly simplify the story a little bit, because whilst it's not as close a run thing as, say, Kohima, It's a really, really tense time. The combined arms columns that go out and destroy the Japanese before they really get organized are all well and good and very successful. But one of the key things that happens towards the end of the battle is the way that the Japanese put a lot of pressure on the airfield. And there are a number of days where, they go 2-3 days where they end up surviving on parachute drops rather than landing planes to unload supplies and get wounded out. And so there are some tense moments towards the end. And again, I sort of cover the duel over the airfield that I kind of call it. In particular, by the way, those who are interested in the RAF history, the RAF regiment have Meiktila as one of its sort of founding moments, one of its battle honours, and so on. And so there is this sort of moment of drama over the airfield. But once the Japanese break, there are two divisions that they try to use to crush the British and Indian troops at Meiktila. Once they break, they really break. You're talking about, give or take, 50% casualties for the Japanese across all of the units that were involved, above the average that an Allied unit would take. It's below the overall average that a Japanese would take in, say, the Pacific. But I think one of the misnomers we have about the Japanese is that they never retreat. And we mentioned earlier that the Japanese retreat. The reason why they don't retreat in the Pacific is because if they're stuck on an island, there's nowhere to retreat to. So the only thing they can do is to die fighting in their foxhole. There is still plenty of that going on in the Burma campaign, but there are plenty of times when the Japanese do retreat. They do withdraw when it's worthwhile. And they do withdraw from the Meiktila battle at the end, as do the Japanese troops fighting in the north, fighting the Chinese, and also the ones that are fighting in Arakan that we mentioned earlier in the show. They do begin to retreat in southern Burma. But the crucial thing for Slim, and this is, remember, the whole point of the operation was he's broken the Japanese army so that when they retreat into the south, instead of them being cohesive, moving into prepared positions, being a planned withdrawal, they are chased into southern Burma rather than withdrawing. And so this is the point where Slim does his final gamble, where instead of letting some of the units from the Thunder Run and Meiktila rest, he forces them on. He drives the horses on because he can't give the Japanese breathing space. If he gives them time to reorganize in the south, the biggest problem, and we didn't mention this earlier, but we probably should have done, the monsoon will come in May. And so he has to defeat the Japanese and get to Rangoon before that monsoon starts. And so once the Japanese break off at Meiktila, there's no operational pause, reorganize, and then go. It's just go. And so they chase the Japanese into the south. And again, there are these amazing scenes where, the Sherman tanks of, Probin's horse, one of those, really romantic Indian cavalry regiments, they're overtaking the Japanese, machine gunning them up as they go past, but overtaking them to be mopped up by someone coming behind. So they can get to Rangoon. And eventually what happens is the monsoon does strike when they're about 50 miles from Rangoon. But luckily, because the Arakan battle is finished, and again, Lucy in her book, Jungle Commandos, does cover this as well, they have planned for this. So an amphibious operation, Operation Dracula, now actually arrives at Rangoon. And because the Japanese have been defeated up at Meiktila, up at Mandalay, they have no real defense. They withdraw from Rangoon. And so the amphibious landing, Operation Dracula, is basically a walkover. They march into the capital. And so therefore the operation is effectively saved by the fact that they've been defeated in the Central Plain 6 weeks earlier. It's not because they suddenly come south to defeat the Japanese at Rangoon and they withdraw. They knew they didn't have the strength to hold it, so they withdraw anyway because of what happened at Meiktila. So it's a huge success. It stopped the Japanese retreating earlier into southern Burma, where they'd have the advantage. Slim and Cowan have then destroyed the Japanese army, and then they've almost walked into Rangoon. Not quite walked in. There's a really famous thing where Rangoon jail, which is horrific, by the way. Rangoon jail has something like a 40% death rate of all the prisoners. What happens with them is when the Japanese leave, they unlock the prison cells. The Allied prisoners have gone out onto the roof. An RAF Mosquito has flown over, seen this, landed at the airfield just above Rangoon, a place called Mingalodon. And he's then basically hitchhiked into town. Japanese really are gone. Because basically his Mosquito, one of his undercarriage wheels, collapsed as he landed because the airfield had been bombed. There were potholes and craters on it. He's hitchhiked into town, gone to the jail. They're all there, very emaciated, starving, but at least they had the the sense of humour for the extract digit comment. He then hitchhikes again down to the landing grounds where they're advancing in land against no opposition. He turns up in like whatever vehicle he's in to say, "Oh yeah, they're all gone, they're done." One of my favourite moments is, and I recount this in the book, is that one of the units that's part of this is the 2nd Battalion of the West Yorkshire, or the West Yorkshire Regiment. Now they had been there in 1942, and a number of them had been captured. There is a moment here where some of the West Yorks of 1942 are freed, emaciated, and in a really bad way. About 13 of them, and they meet the 2nd West Yorks that have come south to rescue them. And it's this wonderful, wonderful moment. There's only 13 of them that survived out of not loads. We're talking about in multiple dozens. But they've taken a lot of them have died in the prison. And they get to sort of swap the stories of what the two different sides of the West Yorks war had been, and also because there are a number of soldiers, and again, MacDonald Fraser talks about this in the Ninth Borders as well. There are soldiers that have been through the entire campaign, and so there's an element of a lot of them finally get closure on mates that they never saw again 3 years previously, because they see them in the prison camp and they say, "Yeah, I saw them go." And some of them they meet people that they thought were gone. No, it's a really, really beautiful moment, actually. And again, it's one of those things where when you do these, and you'll know about this, Chris, you'll have been in the archives and stuff. You find these stories and they are surprisingly moving, much more moving than you expect. And especially from a war diary. Now, this is a war diary that talks about this episode. This isn't some memoir written 50 years later. A war diary records the fact that, the cheer when they get told that they're going to have a rum ration that night. And the fact that they all stay up until 3-4 o'clock in the morning, swapping their stories, these former prisoners and the new guys in the West Yorks. The West Yorks volunteer to take all of the prisoners in because there are West Yorks among them. It's honestly, I think it's one of the most moving things that I did in the book. This moment where the two different groups of the West Yorks meet, the prisoners and the non-prisoners. Lovely, lovely stuff. But in terms of remembrance, though, because you talked about why should we remember it? Apart from the fact that it's important, it is crucial because it is kind of I put it that the Battle of Meiktila is the last big set piece battle. It's not literally the last battle; it's the last big operationally planned set piece. The other operations that happen afterwards are more on the fly, or they're not necessarily on the fly, but they're reactive moments where there is a situation they have to deal with. Meiktila is one where they plan it in a week, but they then carry it out. It lasts about 6 weeks, and then another 6 weeks gets into Rangoon. And it is one of the most phenomenal things that ever happens. Should we say the Battle of Meiktila is 6 weeks. There's 400 miles to Rangoon. It takes another 6 weeks. That's how sort of important the fighting at Meiktila is. They travel, they fight around this individual town for 6 weeks, but they then cover 400 miles of Japanese territory in the following 6 weeks. Really, really amazing stuff. And we should remember it because it's a thoroughly, thoroughly modern battle. Unbelievably modern, these strike forces of, a battalion of infantry, a squadron of tanks, a troop of self-propelled artillery, and also cab ranks of P-47 Thunderbolts. It's generally the USAF doing the air cover, or the close air support. Spitfires are often doing top cover, but it's Thunderbolts that are doing the ground attack of the USAF. This 3D battle, very, very NATO in the modern day and things like that. Again, the links to the Thunder Run in Baghdad that we started this on, and yet nobody knows about it. I've said to people before, this is Blitzkrieg adjacent again, and I said right at the beginning, if Guderian had done this, everyone would be, this is this is your Blitzkrieg, your Wereaboos wet dream, and all this sort of thing, And if people knew about it, why are we fawning over Blitzkrieg? The Nazis were the bad guys. Why are we fawning over that? Why aren't we talking about 14th Army and the Indian troops and the Indian and British tanks and the African soldiers that do 14th Army do? Because, I'm a Burma historian. Maybe I'm not the most objective person. I'm not the most objective judge of Slim perhaps either. But I find it astonishing that we don't remember this more. Because the stories are ridiculous when we look at these things. I talked about the Chindwin Bailey Bridge, the crossing of the Irrawaddy, the Thunder Run to Meiktila. We've not even managed to talk about Pete Rees and Mandalay. I mean, I don't talk about it in the book. I talk about him in Forgotten Armour. We have these most amazing characters. Then you've got the fact that, even from the diversity point of view, this is very much a polyglot. I mean, okay, maybe perhaps it's down to the nature of imperial history that we don't remember it, but there's also a fair bit of nonsense written on that, and
yes,
there is a lot of revisionism in the post-colonial periods to what happens in here. The biggest thing that I will talk about is the Indian Army is the largest ever volunteer army, 2.5 million men, and obviously lots of them fight in Italy and North Africa, not just in Burma. But we often forget the fact that things like the rape of Nanking in 1938, that is front page news in India. And so the Indian independence movement obviously wants what it wants, and it wants it faster than it's getting it. But the point is that the direction of travel in India is towards independence in the 1930s. It's slow for a lot of people, and fair enough. And empires are exploitative by definition at the end of the day. I understand all those things. But I think it's important to understand is that Indian soldiers fought to defend India because they don't want Japanese imperialism to come in just as British imperialism is on the way out. Yeah. And so on the balance of probabilities, if they stick with Britain, if they even think this coldly, and plenty of them don't, Jonathan Fennell has done some brilliant work on this, about what motivates Indian soldiers to fight. An awful lot of them are fighting because what they don't want is Japanese to replace the British, who are clearly on the way out. And so we should remember this because that should be a big part of Indian people should remember this more for those simple reasons. Because again, the INA are insignificant in scale to what the volunteer Indian
about 40 to 50,000 at most, aren't they? Which compared to 2.5 million, the figures don't add up.
And to be honest, they're rubbish.
Yes. Yeah. Well, yeah, you can see that by the way the Japanese use them. Yeah.
Yeah. The Japanese are not kind to their allies, and they are no better to the Indian Army, and that is to the Indian National Army, and that's reflected in their performance. I mean, okay, maybe some of that stuff's very easy for me to say as a white British historian. Fine, fair enough. But I think that the record for a serious scholar stands up.
Yes. Yeah, and the numbers do as well. Let's move on just a little bit because we've mentioned him throughout. Let's talk about Slim, and just towards the end of our conversation, you obviously hold him in very high regard.
Yes.
So do I. Where do you put him on the list of great British generals? With your Marlboroughs and your Wellingtons, and if we want to say, I suppose there'll be those who, for the Second World War, would say Montgomery. I personally
say Cromwell. For all his controversies, Cromwell is a great general.
I would personally throw Alan Brooke into the mix. Where do you put Slim?
Alan Brooke's responsibilities are quite different. His leadership is quite different.
Absolutely.
But in terms of, let's say combat commanders, whose roles are primarily again, we're getting too terms.
I know.
But yes, I'm just so not objective. I'm never going to not say Slim, Chris. That's the trouble. I'm never not going to say him. Look, I'm a huge admirer of Wellington. Wellington is another particular hero of mine. And I think the thing why I come to Wellington is all the great flair of the Thunder Runner, all the things that I've talked about is Slim really understands the nuts and bolts of his army, and that's sometimes forgotten from Wellington. That supplies and logistics, and not overstretching your army. I talked about the judicious use of force rather than hitting a nut with a sledgehammer.
Yeah,
I think that Slim and Wellington have that in common, in that they understand how am I going to use the resources that are available to hand. Slim has to make do with the offcuts of the British Army and the fact that he's the opposite side of the world from both Britain and also the United States, and that both of those two different people have greater threats that in Britain are physically close to home, and India, to America, the Pacific War is obviously closer to their hearts because of Pearl Harbor and so on. These aren't criticisms; these are realities that Slim has to deal with. And Wellington has to deal with similar things. Obviously it's a less globalized world, so Spain sure isn't that far away. But when you're talking about the age of sail, it may as well be. And also the peer nature of the French naval threat and so on. They both have to deal with what is available to them. Wellington is not going to suddenly get an influx of reinforcements because he's clicked his fingers and conscription will kick in, because they don't have that. Conscription in Britain is going into the Western theatre. There's huge problems with replacement troops in British units. There is a really important reason, by the way, that Slim does not use any British units south of the Irrawaddy in this campaign. They're all Indian Army units, because he hasn't got the replacements if any of those guys get killed and wounded. He cannot replace them. He is massively relying on the Indian Army in this period. So I think that's a really important thing if we're going to make comparisons between some of these other commanders. But in terms of the tactical flair, if we're going to then move on to that side of things, Slim is someone who famously says when he makes mistakes in East Africa, and he says it's because he's too cautious. He learns the lesson in 1940-41 that if he's cautious, he gets punished. And so that then feeds into everything he does in Burma. And this is what's so important, is because there are knife-edge moments where if it goes wrong, at Imphal and Kohima, that judicious use of force, if he gets those calculations wrong, if he gets a bloody nose, if he loses Kohima, and Imphal is left without that pressure, that distraction that Kohima is. If Dimapur had fallen, if Kohima had gone, then Dimapur, Imphal is lost with 100,000 soldiers on and around it, potentially. He chooses not to rush in all his reinforcements to Imphal and Kohima. He chooses to use just about the right amount he thinks he should use. Now, I mentioned the Indian tank units that have just received Shermans at the end of 1944. At the beginning of 1944. He could have rushed them into action, but no, their training is important. We need to learn the lessons in 1944. We are not going to rush them into action. We will take the force that is necessary to destroy the Japanese in Imphal, and then we will strike through the monsoon when we have the advantage of numbers and logistics, and then Burma will be less well defended than if we'd given the Japanese 6 months off. And then he reforms that army. We talked about this earlier, but he's completely reformed this army to then be this combined arms manoeuvre outfit, when it had been a slow plodding mule transported and foot transported jungle fighting unit. That complete transformation that he does in a few months, and then wins this great battle against the odds. It should be said that the Japanese do outnumber the Indian army in Burma at the front. And okay, sure, a lot of those Japanese troops, fair enough, their line of communication. But let's be clear that a British or Indian line of communication unit is not going to fight in the way that a Japanese line of communication unit is going to fight. Okay, and you just have to look back to things like the retreat from Burma in 1942. The tail of the British Indian Army does not really fight. It doesn't. The Japanese one absolutely is and does fight. We didn't mention this earlier, but the battle for Meiktila is against line of communication troops, and it is bitter and horrific. And Slim still wins, despite the fact that they outnumber him. And it's really that firepower, the advantages he has because of tanks and artillery and air power and so on. And the fact that at the end of the day, he's chosen to be bold, to strike Meiktila 80 miles behind the enemy lines, because he has confidence in those advantages. And again, I've mentioned Nelson as well. I was not a land commander, but a naval commander. I think about the fact that Nelson knows he's got better trained troops, better technologies on his, ships of the line. And so he can go toe to toe with bigger French ships, and he'll still beat them because the training of his men and the technology. Slim does exactly the same thing. He's got better weapons, better training. He knows he can win against numerical odds. That's why Slim's the greatest commander. People often think of Imphal and Kohima as his legacy. Meiktila 1945, Mandalay, the reconquest of Burma, that should be his legacy.
I think that's part of the point, isn't it? That not enough is known about Slim's campaign. It's called the Forgotten Army for a reason, and that's why we don't probably recognize just how good he actually was. Well, thank you for talking to me today. Obviously, you've done a lot there to help and reintroduce Slim to a lot of people. And where can people get the book if they're interested? I mentioned Chiselbury Publishing to begin with.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if you want to support me personally, obviously, if you buy directly from chiselbury.co.uk,
yes,
that is the best way to support me personally. But we do obviously, we do sell through all the normal people that you would expect, so Waterstones, Amazon, and so on. So you can order online with any of those ones. Some stores might have, but online is probably going to be the best way. It's available on Kindle and other publishers as well. But also, again, if people are really interested, I do a podcast with Robert Lyman as well. I do the Forgotten War podcast at Forgotten War Pod. So if you want to hear the two of us waffle on, we're kind of going through the whole Burma campaign start to finish. We've finished series 2 in the autumn, where we did the whole of 1942. We're just about to start the end of 1942 and go into 1943, so there'll be plenty of chindits in that. But we think that the level of detail and frankly nerdery as well that we're choosing to go to, there was nothing else like it. We were inspired by the fact that some other people did. Some podcasts had done some stuff on things like Burma in 1944, 45. And they were good, but at the end of the day, so much nuance and detail and amazing stories. The Burma campaign has these really, really deep rabbit holes that you can really get lost in. Amazing stories, amazing characters. Like I said, again, guys, if you get both my books, Forgotten Armour, one of my favourite characters got to be Pete Rees, the commander of the 19th Indian Division. The Pocket Napoleon, as he gets nicknamed. Look him up. He's such a great guy. I think I talked about him in the previous time I was on Redcoat History as well. So, yeah.
So just briefly, I mean, what are you working on at the moment then?
Yes, yeah. So over the summer, a few months ago, I did actually do a short version, the Osprey New Vanguard Tanks In series. I've just done one of those on tanks in Burma, but obviously it's one of those small ones and glossy, lots of maps and pictures. Yeah. But my big project now is I'm doing a big book on Burma in 1942. So I've just done the Thunder Run and the Victory in 1945. I'm going all the way back to the beginning. And the big thing I want to do here is that there's not a formal title yet. I've got a working title, but I'm not sure I'm going to stick with it yet. But the point of it is that Burma 1942 is like Churchill says, war's not won by retreats. He's talking about Dunkirk, and Burma is the same thing. However, the Burma campaign is the longest retreat in the British Army's history, but it is a fighting retreat. It is a cohesive unit when it exits. It is horrifically battered. It's taken incredible casualties, but it is whole. And it is fought very bravely and at times actually very successfully. And a bit like the British Army in the Battle of France, it's kind of circumstance. Not entirely, I will explore the subtleties of this general point that I'm making in the book. But the British Army and the Indian Army generally fight reasonably well, but it's the circumstances that they find themselves in that cause the retreat. And I'm not just doing the land campaign either. I'm doing the Chinese role, which often is overlooked, the air role, so RAF and the American Volunteer Group. I mean, let's be honest, who doesn't love a P-40 Kitty Hawk with tiger teeth on it? And also the civilian thing, because generally books tends to be either land war, air war of the 1942, or the civilian experience. And there are some wonderful books. The intention is this is going to be 120,000 words that does all of them, and that's through Osprey Publishing. So that will be out in 2027.
So there you go, guys. Look up Jack's books. They're brilliant. Thanks to everyone who commented and joined in the live chat. We'll have more long-form interviews on the live stream soon. I'm trying to make them a sort of semi-regular thing, maybe once or twice a month. Saturday mornings, 11 a.m. UK time will be the spot. Also, Chris Brice, who conducted that interview, and I think you'll admit did a damn good job, is starting his own podcast soon. I think he's brilliant, so I'll be sure to share details of that as soon as I've got them. All right, guys, have a fantastic weekend. I'll be back with more interviews and incredible stories from British military history very, very soon.